I'm Alex.
I'm Robbie.
And this is Combat Thoughts.
We take a deeper look at the culture and philosophy behind martial arts. All right, so topic is difference between a martial art and a sport. A lot of people talk about wrestling not really being a martial art. Joe Rogan might disagree, but it's typically seen as a sport, whereas something like karate, even though you can be competitive in it, it's universally accepted as a martial art. And then you get other stuff that's somewhere in between, boxing, for example. Well, again, a lot of people see it as a sport. So kind of what's the difference and why do we label those two things that way?
My initial thoughts on that is somewhat around the culture that is prominent in the Eastern countries, which adds a sense of like a warrior's path in the martial arts that they tend to project onto the world. And I've seen, I was reading, actually I started reading the Book of Five Rings, and you can kind of see, it when he talks about the martial arts and the way, as he calls it, I don't know, there's always a deeper sense of meaning to what they talk about, and there's like a deeper will to understand the movements and these sorts of things. And I think that sense of mysticism to some extent kind of makes something a martial art more than it does a sport.
So you think it's to do with like the philosophy of whatever it is?
I think
because I could see that.
I think it's definitely something that we as Westerners think of when we say martial arts. We tend to think of karate, as you said, and like Tai Chi.
I think it's things that are intrinsically linked with history, when there's such a history to refer back to. So you look at things coming out of Japan, and you've got links to the samurai warriors and things like that. You get that real story and the kind of philosophical way of life around it as well. But I also think there's a huge snobbery in the way you talk about a martial art. And I think people look at wrestling and go, it's not martial art, it's a sport. Or MMA, it's not a martial art, it's a sport now. And that's the way it's been commercialized, and that's the way we receive it now, because we don't go and fight in fields anymore, and that's not the way things work.
Well, I think I'd have to disagree with the history aspect, because though you've got like you said, there are links to the samurai warriors and that culture. I think it's the cultural relevance, because things like taekwondo is not an old sport or martial art. And most people probably consider taekwondo a martial art. Taekwondo came around within the last less than 100 years. A much older sport. Boxing is much older for a start. Boxing was a huge thing in the Victorian era, not like it is today, but pugilism really was a genuine sport then. And if you want to talk about history, wrestling is just about the oldest sport imaginable. It can't be an age thing that dictates whether it's a martial arts or not.
So I think I would sort of agree there, because if you look at wrestling, for example, wrestling has, since the ages has been a sport. Like the Olympics, the old Olympics in Roman times, they would have had wrestling. It's like you got the Congolese wrestling, which I'm sure has been around for centuries, and that's like it's a show of power to your local community. It's what I think. What and this just came to mind is that I think with martial arts, what its stem is, it's more linked to you actually defending yourself and like using the art in battle to some extent. And this is where I think Muay Thai actually maybe used to be a martial art, but has moved into a sport aspect. Because I think Muay Thai used to be more of an art you would use in battle as well. So the techniques that were used. So maybe it has something to do with, you know, like karate was it was a form of hand-to-hand combat that was developed for supposedly, you know, like fighting physically an opponent on a battlefield.
Yeah, so I agree with like what you were saying with the history side of it, and I think we was getting to the same point in the terms of culture. I think for a martial art, it's more about the journey and what you're learning from it, why you're doing it, what you're getting from it. When you get into sport, there's a very clear end game. You're going to fight this person in X weeks for this amount of money. That's when it becomes the sport side. But I know loads of people who train and have trained for a very long time who just want to get a bit fitter or help their mental health or things like that. That's where kind of true martial arts is it's about the journey and how you progress through learning a martial art and how it affects your life, impacts you in a better way and things like that.
I do like that because I think what might define a combat sport is it's why people get into it. I don't think anyone gets into karate to be you know, people probably don't often get into karate to be the best karateka or whatever you call it in the world. Whereas, you know, we know that people get into boxing to make money.
Yeah.
People get into it as a way of life. So, you know, people get into it to make a living for themselves a lot of the time. People definitely get into boxing for it. People get into MMA for it. Maybe not money even then, because wrestling, you know, there's no money in it. So perhaps the fact that it's competition based. Whereas
then in wrestling, you look at the US, and that's how you get your college scholarship, and that's how you get a full scholarship on wrestling. That's worth a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, Kamaru Usman got his scholarship, I'm pretty sure, through wrestling.
You get in one of them Olympic camps, and they if you've not got a lot of other prospects, you can make quite a bit of money off it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And then, but on the flip side, you get stuff like even modern stuff like Krav Maga. You know, there's not really a competition aspect to that. It's definitely, you know, it's hard to call Krav Maga a combat sport.
Yeah.
That's definitely about a self-defense that's more of a self-defense angle. And, you know, you might compare it to something like at the very opposite end of the spectrum, still within martial arts, might be Tai Chi.
Yeah.
No one's getting into Tai Chi to be the best Tai Chi guy around.
And I think that was my point earlier around the snobbery side of it. And I've heard people speak disparagingly of those martial arts and kind of not be into them and say they're not real and they're whatever else. And that's where a true martial art is that it's not a case of, I think it's the real stupid childish argument of my dad can beat your dad and my dad would beat your dad in a fight. It's not that. That's not what martial arts is.
Yeah.
Martial arts is as much about self-improvement, but making your mental health better than being able to stand in a room and go, I'm the hardest person in here, because it doesn't mean shit.
Yeah.
Do you think that self-defense is intrinsically linked to martial arts? Because
I think that's where it has stemmed from. Like we're seeing now there are perhaps more effective ways of doing that, of self-defense. But I do think a lot of the martial arts that we consider martial arts, like taekwondo, karate, you know, these ancient arts like judo, whatever, they were stemming from developing techniques that can be used in like physical hand-to-hand combat. They weren't techniques that you were necessarily, I mean, yeah, it's not like for showmanship or like boxing where the goal isn't really to defend yourself as such. Maybe the techniques that have developed have allowed for that, and you can actually use boxing in a self-defense scenario. But I think the stem of it, the ground is different.
So where do things like, to come back to it, stuff like Tai Chi, I know there are techniques, but it's hard to claim that you're able to defend yourself by doing Tai Chi or maybe Capoeira. it's hard to say that you can defend yourself doing capoeira. Now, I know we're getting a bit away from the sport argument here. These are kind of on the other end of the spectrum. They're more of a dance.
Mm-hmm.
But do you still consider those to be martial arts?
I think for me, yeah. So I think because they're built around the basis of fighting, and they're about movement, they're about the way you throw a kick. I don't think you need to do a martial. For me, I don't think the definition of doing a martial art is to get great at beating people up. It's using the ways of fighting through, if it is through dance or it is through meditation and breathing out and pushing things out in Tai Chi and things like that. It's linked back to fighting and is a martial art. I think the definition of a martial art for me isn't it provides you with a level of self-defense. I think most martial arts provide a level of self-defense, provide a level of competition, or can do. But I don't think I'm ready to kind of discount capoeira as not a martial art because you don't actually kick anybody.
That's fair. Then,
I mean, with karate, for example, I think the reason why it has become less like a self-defense, like a fighting style, is that it's actually, I think, been more tailored towards competition. Like things have been changing to make it more into a competition style art than an actual fighting art. And of course there are variants of karate. So like I think Kyokushin is still has a lot of good aspects to it that can be applied quite well to a fight. But like Shotokan, which is the one I've trained, it's more about sets, and there's no even contact in kumite, which is the fighting part of it. You can't actually hit someone.
Well, then,
so that's something I wanted to cover on this, and taking it then into the sport bit. So we're doing martial arts kind of versus being a sport. When you look at the old school kumites and the real kind of infancy of what then turned into MMA, people running around gym to gym. You hear stories about the Gracies back in the day. Hicks and Gracie was just going from gym to gym, beating the fuck out of people by all accounts. But is the way it becomes a sport is when it becomes commercialized, because they're doing what they did later in life anyway and got paid for it. Is the whole thing of it becomes a sport is when money gets involved.
I've got to wonder because, it wouldn't be money again. It's about because I think it wouldn't be money because there's a reason that wrestling's not considered a martial art in general. It's about maybe not just money, about renown because you have it in the Olympics and stuff like that. But I kind of see where you're coming from. I've got to wonder, is that what's happening to Jiu-Jitsu? Because, now that you're creating these Jiu-Jitsu shows that are building much more of the boxing and MMA model, becoming a professional Jiu-Jitsu competitor is not easy, but it is possible to make a living out of it. If you are look at Gordon Ryan, he makes a lot of money at the seminars, but I'm sure he would definitely get by just on the competitions as well. If you win ADCC, you are set. I've got to wonder, a lot of these things, as they become more popular, as they become incorporated into the Olympics, like karate and potentially Muay Thai, and people want jiu-jitsu, some people want jiu-jitsu, do they slowly transition away from being a martial art?
Yeah, and I so that's a good point, because if you think of so you take Muay Thai, I've done it for a long time. You look at the way you fight, it's changed completely. It's no longer around learning the best techniques. I remember one of the first Muay Thai gyms I walked into, there was posters on the wall from Thailand from back in the day of all the kind of signature moves, catch the kick, breaking the elephant's tusk on the leg, all those kind of stuff. And great, they're just a great bit of history. I used to love them as a kid. But actually, the way I trained was never like that. The way I trained was kick there, that's how you score the most points. Catch that kick, block that kick, hit them back like this. And it was always built around the sport of this is how you score points, this is how you win a fight. It was never, here is the entire encyclopedia of Muay Thai and you need to learn it. And then you're going to be a Muay Thai master or whatever it is. It's, here's how you win in a fight. That's how I've trained all my life. So for my life in Muay Thai, it's felt for me more like a sport.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I've had the same experience with Thai boxing, and when I started, I was actually really interested in in things like the white crew,
Mhm.
all the traditional parts of it, because I came from a karate background. So the martial art part of it, if we can call it that, um, is was something that appealed to me. So I was quite interested in that. But again, when you actually train, you don't do that. It's more about, as you say, it's more about the sport aspect. It's how to score points, and that kind of thing.
Do you think there are any things that people consider? Well, maybe Muay Thai would be one of these. Something that people consider a martial art that's maybe more of a sport now. Because I got to wonder about judo, for example,
Mm.
with it coming into the Olympics and with so many techniques being taken away by its involvement in the Olympics and the influence of the
Mhm.
Olympic Committee, like no longer shooting double legs, stuff like that.
Mm.
It's moving more and more away from. It's moving away from the self-defense aspect because it's no longer quite as applicable as a general wrestling or jiu-jitsu sort of takedown method.
Right.
And it's moving towards international renown and fame, and a way to get that by being a judoka.
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's not a martial art, but out of any of them that people consider to be martial arts, it's one of the ones that's getting further and further away.
And I think that goes back to your point of, as popularity goes up, does it become more of a sport? As popularity goes up, do you get really a watered down version of what the traditional martial art was? Karate isn't what it was
No.
hundreds of years ago. Muay Thai isn't. Judo isn't. Are we? Is
We're
as they
kind of
become more
seeing that with
popular?
jiu-jitsu as well now.
Yeah, yeah. I did the first 2-3 years of doing jiu-jitsu. I never did a leg lock,
Mm.
and then
Okay, but I'll tell
out
you
of nowhere.
why I think jiu-jitsu is going to evolve a bit differently is that because it's not part of the Olympics and because there is so much freedom with the
Hmm.
rule sets, it keeps it being effective grappling rather than effective jiu-jitsu. Because you can change the rule set so often, it opens up so many other techniques. That's why leg locks have become a thing more recently. Whereas, other sports that are 100 years old don't. Jiu-jitsu's changed a lot in the past 10 years. And it's, Brazilian jiu-jitsu's from when? I mean, yeah, give or take 100 years, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Whereas judo, a bit older. I don't think it's a lot older. Um, I don't think it's changed the dramatic amount in the past 10 years because they're more constrained by the rule sets.
But that's the thing, jiu-jitsu hasn't had the mainstream kind of
Yeah.
adoption in the Olympics. So there's not an overarching board that has said, this is how we score jiu-jitsu.
Exactly. But that's why I think it stays almost more true to
Mhm.
not necessarily what it looked like 100 years ago, but to the spirit of it, I
I think
guess, as effective grappling.
I think it's had the potential to become like judo with IBJJF, but luckily there are other organizations that are challenging those rule sets and creating new ones. So so
But then you've still got jiu-jitsu, and I agree with what you said, Robbie, but then you've also got jiu-jitsu at the point in its existence now where it's not had its Ultimate Fighter moment. It's not blown up into the mainstream, and it's not blown up as this is what people want to see. Is there a risk in jiu-jitsu then that if something takes off, I don't know what rule set, but no time limit, sub only, what then becomes
No
the way
one's
you
watching
keep.
that.
Yeah, no one is. But what then becomes is then you get a very kind of strict criteria if you want to make money in this kind of aspect. If you want people to come to your classes, this is the type of stuff you're teaching. I get completely that that hasn't happened with jiu-jitsu, but I think as things get more commercialized, the opportunity comes to make money from it. There's always that intervention where somebody sets some rules that then kind of ring fences what you get taught.
So you think that as jiu-jitsu becomes more popular and if people actually start wanting to watch it, which I am doubtful they will, that's eventually going to be the tipping point where jiu-jitsu moves away from being a true martial art, as it were.
Yeah, so yeah, I think if let's say they have an ultimate fighter moment and Gordon Ryan has an 8-minute back and forth with Andre Galvao, and it's the best thing in the world, and suddenly it's on Sky Sports. I can't wait to see that. But at that point then, and that's what people are being introduced to as jiu-jitsu as, and that's what's exciting to them, and that's what they want to see, that then becomes the rule set, and that then becomes the criteria in which you're deemed successful in the sport. So then you train that way. You don't let's say arm bars are seen as boring. And this is a really bad example, but I can't think of anything else. Let's say arm bars are seen as boring, and every time you go for an arm bar, the crowd boos. Yeah. Arm bars are not going to get taught as frequently in classes, and there's going to be more other things and things like this. I mean, that then becomes the rule set for success in the sport.
I mean, I think that this is already happening with jiu-jitsu, with IBJJF, that there are schools that will not teach certain techniques because it doesn't comply with IBJJF rules.
I've done comp classes before where you learn, get a scruffy takedown and hold on and win by 2 points. Yeah. And it's some of the most successful gyms I've trained at in terms of medals. Yeah. Because it is literally just medal, take down 2 points, stall. And there's all these cool ways you can learn to stall.
And there we go. And that's why it's getting more away from the martial art and more towards the sport aspect, because it's about winning a competition rather than about defending yourself and about the sort of, maybe it's still about the struggle. You can get that struggle out of sport, but it's less about defending yourself and it's less about the technique and it's more about victory at any cost.
Yeah, and so it's meeting the rule set and achieving the goal that's been set by the sport. And I think the goal of a martial art is to learn something new, to grow in whichever way you kind of want to from a martial art.
So I guess it's the glory aspect, the finance aspect that pushes stuff towards glory and finance, and the fact that you get into it to be the best and to be the victor. That's where combat sport falls into it instead.
Yeah. For me, yeah.
Nice. We just solved the world's problems, guys. Good
Did
work.
we come down on a conclusion on this one?
I think we did.
I think we just did.
20 episodes in and we get a conclusion.
Okay. Nice one. All right.